My world was built on secrets, but not my own. I was an architect of other people's truths, a surgeon cutting out the cancerous lies that grew in the dark between married couples. I thought I knew every shadow, every flicker of the eye, every hesitant pause that betrayed a guilty heart. I could read a man's text message history in the tension of his shoulders as he hugged his wife hello. I could smell another woman's perfume on him even if he'd changed his shirt in the car, a ghost of jasmine or vanilla clinging to the cuff of his sleeve, a scent that didn't belong to the life he was supposed to be coming home to. I was a connoisseur of deceit, a master of the art of exposure. My name is Elena Rostova, and for 12 years, I was the best private investigator in the city for one thing, and one thing only, catching cheating husbands. I built a fortress of certainty in a world of emotional chaos, and I was the one who held the keys. I handed women their shattered realities, their proof, their terrible, life-altering truth. I was their savior and their destroyer, all in one. And the greatest irony, the one that would eventually split my own life clean in two, was that I became blind to the one heartbreak that was happening right under my own roof, in my own marriage, in my own bed. It's funny, the things you choose to see. The lens of my camera was a ruthless, unbiased eye. It captured the clandestine kisses in rain-smeared car windows, the intertwined fingers under restaurant tables, the easy, familiar laughter shared with someone who was not his wife. Through that viewfinder, the world was stark and clear. There was truth, and there was lie. There was fidelity, and there was betrayal. It was a binary universe, and I was its righteous God, delivering judgment in the form of time-stamped photographs and GPS logs. I never questioned my own sight, my own perception. The camera didn't lie. And I, Elena, who interpreted its silent testimony, could not be fooled. I lived in a world of evidence, of cold, hard fact. Emotion was the enemy of clarity, intuition was just a hunch until it was proven. I prided myself on my objectivity, my ability to detach. It was my greatest professional strength and, as I would learn, the fatal flaw in my personal life. I remember the moment I decided this would be my life with a clarity that still aches. I was 24, and my best friend, Clara, was a ghost of herself. We had been roommates in college, two young women with our whole lives ahead of us, dreaming of love that was grand and enduring. Her vibrant light, the one that could illuminate a whole room with its warmth, had been snuffed out by the slow, creeping suspicion that her husband, Mark, was unfaithful. He was always working late, his phone was a vault he guarded with a new, nervous energy, and his affection, when he offered it, felt rehearsed, like lines from a play he was tired of performing. But he was clever, a lawyer who knew how to build a case, even one for his own innocence. He never slipped, never left a crumb of concrete evidence. He gaslit her so skillfully she started to believe she was going insane, that her intuition was a form of paranoia, a sickness of a jealous mind. I saw the life draining from her eyes, replaced by a frantic, hollow fear. I watched her check his collar for lipstick, his phone bill for strange numbers, his credit card statements for hotel rooms. She was drowning in a sea of doubt, and he was calmly standing on the shore, telling her the water was fine. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't watch my brilliant, funny friend be systematically dismantled. I borrowed a friend's long lens camera, a hulking piece of equipment I barely knew how to use. I spent 3 nights sitting in my beat-up sedan outside a bland mid-tier hotel on the outskirts of the city, surviving on lukewarm coffee from a thermos and a burning, righteous sense of injustice. The seat became a confessional, the steering wheel an altar where I prayed for a sign, for the truth to reveal itself, for my friend to be set free from her prison of uncertainty. On the 3rd night, the rain came down in sheets, blurring the world into streaks of neon and shadow. And then, I saw them. Mark, holding an umbrella, his arm wrapped tightly around a young woman with bright red hair, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, leaning down to whisper something that made her throw her head back and laugh, a sound I couldn't hear but could feel in the intimate curve of her body. The image, though grainy and distorted by the rain on my windshield, was devastatingly clear. It was a tableau of betrayal, a perfect, terrible picture. I remember the cold, sharp clarity that settled over me, a feeling like ice water in my veins. This wasn't murky emotion or fragile intuition. This was fact. I had captured a truth that could set my friend free, even if that freedom was paved with broken glass and the shards of her former life. When I showed Clara the photos the next morning in my tiny apartment, she didn't cry. She sat at my kitchen table, a neat, quiet woman who had been replaced by this anxious stranger, and she let out a long, shaky breath, as if she'd been holding it for a year, for the entire duration of her marriage. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers trembling as they traced the outline of her husband's betrayal on the camera's small, glowing screen. "Now I know I'm not crazy." In that moment, as I watched the terrible certainty settle into her bones, I found my calling. I would be the one who gave women like Clara the gift of clarity. I would be the anchor in the storm of their doubt, the one who handed them a map of their own ruined landscape so they could find their way out. I enrolled in investigative courses, got my license, and built my business from the ground up, naming it Veritas Investigations. Truth. That was all I traded in. It was a clean, simple, noble purpose. My own life, my marriage to David, was supposed to be the antithesis of the sordid dramas I documented. He was my sanctuary, my safe harbor. We met in our second year of art history, two shy students who found each other in the silent, hallowed halls of the university library, surrounded by the dusty smell of old books and the towering ghosts of Michelangelo and Da Vinci. He was pointing at a reproduction of Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew, his finger tracing the beam of light that cut through the darkness. "It's about the moment everything changes," he'd said, his voice soft but sure. "A single, divine interruption that alters the course of a life." I looked from the painting to his face, at the earnest passion in his eyes, and I felt my own life shift on its axis. He was the steady, warm center of my often chaotic world. Where my job became all shadows and suspicion, David was sunlight and open windows. He was a graphic designer who worked from a home studio, his life a quiet, beautiful rhythm of sketches, the rich smell of coffee brewing in the mornings, and the gentle, rhythmic click of his mouse. He was the man who remembered to buy my favorite mango yogurt, who never complained when I had to leave for a stakeout in the middle of a lovingly prepared dinner, who would rub my shoulders after a long, soul-wearying day of peering into the abyss of other people's failed marriages, his hands kneading the tension away until I could almost believe the ugliness didn't exist. Our home was my fortress, my tangible proof that the world I investigated was the exception, not the rule. A beautiful, old brownstone we'd painstakingly restored together over 5 years, scraping away layers of old wallpaper, sanding floors until the original grain of the wood shone through, arguing good-naturedly over paint swatches and light fixtures. Every piece of furniture, every splash of color on the wall, was a shared decision, a testament to our partnership, our shared taste, our intertwined lives. My favorite place in the world was his studio on the top floor, a sun-drenched room that smelled perpetually of ink and paper and creativity, where his beautiful, intricate drawings were pinned to the walls and classical music always played softly in the background. That room, and the man who worked in it, was my living, breathing proof that love could be simple, loyal, and enduring. It was the control group in the grand, messy, flawed experiment of human relationships that I observed and dissected every single day. I built a wall, a thick, impenetrable pane of one-way glass, between my work and my life. On one side, I was Elena the investigator, cold, logical, detached, a hunter in a world of prey. On the other, I was Elena the wife, soft, trusting, and deeply in love, a woman who believed in the sanctity of her vows. I never brought my work home. I never regaled David with the sordid tales of the men I'd caught, the elaborate lies I'd unraveled, the tears of the wives I'd comforted. I thought I was protecting him, protecting us, from the ugliness. I thought the filth of my profession couldn't stick to me, couldn't stain the fabric of our marriage, if I just took a long, hot shower and changed my clothes before I walked through my own front door, leaving the dirt of other people's lives on the welcome mat. I was so careful, so vigilant, about keeping the poison out. I never considered, not for a single second, that the blindness wasn't from what I brought in, but from what I had failed to see already growing and festering inside our own walls. I was so busy watching the door for intruders that I didn't notice the foundation was cracking. The first sign, in retrospect, was silence. Not a loud, angry, punishing silence, but a soft, quiet one. The kind that settles like a fine layer of dust over everything, muting the colors, dulling the sounds. David had always been a quiet man, an introvert who recharged in solitude, but his quiet had been a comfortable, companionable one. It was the quiet of shared space, of two people so deeply in tune they didn't need to fill the air with constant noise. It was a silence that felt like peace. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, like the minute hand on a clock, it changed. It became the quiet of distance, of two separate islands drifting in the same sea. He started spending more and more time in his studio, the door not quite closed, but not fully open either, a subtle boundary that hadn't been there before. I told myself he was on a deadline, a big project for a new client. He was immersed in his creative flow. A good wife, a supportive partner, gives her husband the space he needs to create. I wore my understanding like a badge of honor. Then came the missed moments, the small deaths of 1,000 tiny intimacies. Our sacred ritual of Friday night wine and a movie on the couch, a tradition that had survived hectic jobs and family obligations, started to falter. "I'm just really tired, Lena," he'd say, his smile a fleeting, fragile thing that didn't quite reach his eyes, which seemed to look through me, at some point on the wall behind my head. "Let's just do it tomorrow, yeah." Tomorrow would come, and he'd be distracted, his gaze drifting towards the window, towards his phone lighting up with a notification, anywhere but at me, present in the room. I'd talk about my day, about a funny thing I'd seen a pigeon do, or a frustratingly paranoid client, and he'd nod, make the right sounds of agreement or sympathy, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. He was waiting for his turn to speak, or more often, waiting for the conversation to be over. The thread of our connection, once so strong I could feel its vibration across a crowded room, felt thin, frayed, on the verge of snapping. I'd reach for his hand across the dinner table, a gesture that had once been as natural as breathing, and his fingers would be limp in mine, his returning squeeze a ghost of what it once was, a polite reflex rather than a passionate connection. My professional self, the part of me that was a finely tuned instrument for detecting falsehood, was screaming at me from a locked room in the back of my mind. The evidence was there, laid out like clues in a client's file. The decreased physical affection. The noticeable lack of sustained eye contact. The emotional withdrawal, the retreat into a private world I was no longer part of. If this had been a case, if a woman had sat in my office and described this exact behavior in her husband, I would have nodded grimly, stamped the file with a big, red suspected infidelity and started surveillance immediately. I would have told her to trust her gut, that her intuition was picking up on the subtle signals of a man who was checked out, who was emotionally, if not physically, gone. But this was David. My David. The man who wrote me love notes on sticky pads and left them on the bathroom mirror for me to find in the morning. The man who cried quiet, happy tears when we adopted our old, scruffy, rescue dog, Buster, because he said his heart was too full of joy. To suspect him felt like a profound act of betrayal, a contamination of our sacred space with the cynical, jaded poison of my job. It felt like I was being disloyal to the very idea of us. So, I did what any expert would do with inconvenient data, I explained it all away. I was, after all, the master of constructing narratives from evidence, and I constructed the most elaborate, convincing one of my entire career for my own life. He stressed about work. The freelance life is uncertain. He's turning 40 soon, it's a classic midlife moment of reflection, it happens to everyone. We've been married for 15 years, this is just what long-term comfort feels like, the passionate fire banked to a warm, steady, reliable glow. The spark doesn't always crackle, sometimes it just provides a gentle heat. I curated the evidence, meticulously discarding the damning pieces and highlighting the benign, the normal, the everyday. He still made me coffee every single morning, didn't he? The French press, with just the right amount of coarse grind, the way I liked it. He still slept on his side of the bed. He hadn't changed his phone password, had he? I checked one day, a flush of shame heating my face as I typed in my birthday and the screen unlocked. See? I told myself, my heart pounding with a sickening mix of relief and self-loathing. Everything was fine. I was just imagining things, projecting the pathologies of my work onto my healthy marriage. I was the problem. Meanwhile, at work, the cases kept coming, a relentless tide of human frailty. Mrs. Albrecht, a woman with the saddest, most resigned eyes I'd ever seen, was convinced her husband of 30 years was having an affair with his golf instructor. She wasn't angry, she was just tired. Tired of wondering, tired of the little digs and the unexplained absences. I took the case, and within a week, I had the proof. I was parked outside a driving range on the other side of town, my camera with its massive telephoto lens trained on Mr. Albrecht like a sniper. He wasn't golfing. He was standing by the cashier's booth, holding hands with a vibrant, laughing woman half his age, feeding her bits of a soft pretzel, his face illuminated with a joy and ease I was sure Mrs. Albrecht hadn't seen in decades. He looked young again, unburdened. As I clicked the shutter over and over, capturing the intimate, devastating tableau, my phone vibrated on the passenger seat. I glanced down, my finger still pressing the button. It was a text from David. "Hey, won't be home for dinner. Working late on the Crestfield account. Don't wait up." The words were ordinary. Benign. A common message in the life of any working person. But sitting in that car, the smell of stale coffee and my own anxiety thick in the air, surrounded by the high-definition proof of another man's betrayal, a cold dread, sharp as a shard of glass, trickled down my spine. It was the first time his absence felt like a presence. The first time one of his simple, reasonable explanations felt like a cover story. A line he'd written for a character he was playing. I shook my head, physically shaking off the feeling, as if I could dislodge the disloyal thought. I was projecting. I was surrounded by lies all day, and it was infecting me, making me paranoid, turning me into the kind of suspicious wife I usually pitied. This was the occupational hazard I had always feared, becoming so jaded, so cynical, that I could no longer trust the one person in the world who truly deserved it. I delivered the photos to Mrs. Albrecht in my office the next day. She sat in the client chair, a neat, quiet woman, her hands folded primly in the lap of her expensive wool coat. She didn't cry as she flipped through the file, the glossy 8x10 print stark under the fluorescent lights. She just seemed to grow smaller, to diminish, as if the weight of the truth was physically compressing her, pressing her down into the floor. "I knew it," she said finally, her voice a dry, rustling whisper. "For 30 years, a part of me knew. But another part of me, a more stubborn, hopeful part, prayed that for 30 years, I was just a foolish, suspicious woman." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with a terrible, heartbreaking clarity. "You know, my dear, the lies we tell ourselves are always the most dangerous ones. We cling to them, we furnish them and decorate them and live inside them, because the real truth, the one waiting outside, is simply too heavy to hold." Her words struck me with the force of a physical blow. They echoed in the silent, sterile interior of my car on the drive home, a haunting refrain I couldn't silence. The lies we tell ourselves. I turned up the radio, blasting a pop song, trying to drown them out, to fill the empty space with meaningless noise. When I got home, the house was dark and still, the way it often was now. A single light was on in the kitchen, but it felt more like a beacon of absence than a welcome. David was in his studio. I could see the strip of light under the door. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding with a ridiculous, unwarranted anxiety, my palms slick with sweat. I felt like an intruder in my own home. I pushed the door open. He was at his large, wooden drawing table, bathed in the cool blue light of his computer monitor, a complicated vector drawing glowing on the screen. He looked up, startled, as if I'd pulled him from a deep dream. "Hey, you're back," he said. His smile was quick, a flash of teeth, then gone. It didn't reach his eyes, which were shadowed and tired. "Yeah," I said, hovering in the doorway, feeling like a child waiting for permission to enter. "How was your night? Did you get a lot done on the Crestfield account?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a pause so brief anyone else would have missed it. But I wasn't anyone else. I was a professional noticer of pauses. His eyes darted almost imperceptibly back to the screen, to the drawing that looked nothing like the branding work he did for corporate clients. Yeah. It's coming along. A few more late nights like that should do it, push it over the finish line." I looked at him, my husband of 15 years. I saw the faint, permanent shadows under his eyes that had taken up residence in the last year, the new strands of silver at his temples that I used to find so distinguished, so handsome. I saw the man I loved, the man whose face was the map of my adult life. And for the first time, standing there in the doorway, I also saw a subject. My investigator's brain, the part one had suppressed and locked away for so long, broke free of its chains and began to whir to life. It was a quiet, insistent, terrifying hum in the back of my skull, a machine booting up after a long sleep. It started cross-referencing, analyzing, comparing his micro-expressions to 1,000 I'd seen before. The hesitation. The averted gaze. The vague answer. The evidence was mounting, and I could no longer pretend I didn't see it. The next few weeks were a slow-motion unraveling, a silent, secret investigation I launched against my own husband. I became a ghost in my own marriage, a phantom observing David with a clinical detachment that felt both foreign and horrifyingly familiar. It was a betrayal in itself, this surveillance, and the guilt was a sour taste in my mouth every morning. I noted the increased time he spent on his phone, the way he now instinctively angled the screen away from me when a notification popped up, a move I called the guilty tilt in my professional notes. I registered, with a sinking heart, the new passwords on his personal laptop and tablet, something he'd never had before. We'd always had an open device policy, a symbol of our trust. Just a security upgrade, he'd mumbled, not meeting my eyes, when I'd asked about it over breakfast. You know, with all the hacking these days. I catalogued the late nights at the office that were becoming more frequent, the business dinners with clients whose names I'd never heard him mention before, the weekend work sessions that left him smelling not of ink and paper, but of the sterile, air-conditioned air of a co-working space he'd supposedly rented. The evidence was still circumstantial. Flimsy. The kind of thing I would have dismissed in any other case for lack of concrete probable cause. There was no smoking gun, no other woman's name, no scent of unknown perfume. But the feeling, the gut-deep, primal feeling that Mrs. Albrecht had spoken of, was now a screaming, relentless siren inside me. The lie I had been telling myself, that everything was fine, that this was just a phase, that I was the problem, was beginning to crack under the weight of my own unwanted observations. I was living in the space between what I knew professionally and what I wanted to believe personally, and the chasm was widening every day, threatening to swallow me whole. The climax, when it came, wasn't dramatic in the way my cases were. There was no other woman caught in a compromising position on my camera. No lipstick stain on his collar. No perfumed text message lighting up his phone. It was a Tuesday evening, utterly mundane. I was in my home office, the one I rarely used anymore, cleaning out an old filing cabinet, a mountain of past cases, of other people's resolved heartbreaks, surrounding me on the floor. I was shredding years of pain, the mechanical whir of the machine a satisfying, final sound of closure. I was purging the past, trying to make room for a future I was desperately hoping to reclaim. I reached for a thick, heavy folder from a case 2 years prior, a particularly messy and politically sensitive one involving a city councilman and his intern. As I pulled it out, a small, flat, black object, no bigger than a credit card but thicker, fell from between the pages and clattered onto the hardwood floor. It was a burner phone. A cheap, prepaid, untraceable thing. The kind of phone I sometimes used for certain undercover operations. The kind of phone cheating husbands bought for their secret lives. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. This wasn't from any of my cases. I was meticulous, almost obsessive, with evidence. I kept it all in a locked safe at my commercial office. I never, ever brought it home. This was something else. This was personal. With trembling fingers, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy, I pressed the power button. The screen lit up with a generic logo. The battery icon was flashing red, almost dead, but it had one last sliver of charge, one final message to deliver. There was no password. It went straight to a simple home screen. My breath hitched in my throat. I navigated to the Messages app with a finger that felt numb. There was only one conversation thread. No other calls, no other texts. Just this one. The contact was saved under a single, stark letter, D. My husband. David. The world narrowed, the edges of my vision darkening, until all that existed was the glowing screen in my hand, this cheap piece of plastic that held the power to detonate my life. I scrolled up, my eyes scanning the texts, my brain struggling to process the words. They weren't what I expected. They weren't love notes. They weren't salacious or explicit. There were no pet names, no plans for rendezvous. They were far, far worse. D, I just don't know how to do this anymore. It feels like we're roommates. Polite strangers who share a mortgage. D, she's a stranger to me. She comes home, and she's somewhere else entirely. In her head, with all those other broken marriages. I look at her and I see a detective, not my wife. D, I try to talk to her, to tell her I'm struggling, but it's like she's listening for a lie, for an inconsistency. She's profiling me. I can't live under that microscope. D, I miss you. I miss us. This is so hard. This waiting. D, I know. But we have to be patient. For the kids. Kids. The word jumped out at me, a punch to the gut. We didn't have kids. We had chosen not to, a mutual decision made early in our marriage, content with our careers and each other. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. I felt dizzy, the room tilting on its axis. I kept scrolling, back, through months and months of messages. It was a chronicle, a real-time diary of my own marriage's dissolution, narrated by my husband to someone else. A confidant. An emotional anchor. It was all there. His profound loneliness. His feeling of being constantly judged, of being investigated. His description of me as a stranger, a detective. His mourning for the us that was gone. And then, my eyes fell on the final text, sent just a week ago, the last entry in this tragic log. D, I think I've fallen out of love with her. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a decision. It was 1,000 tiny cuts. 1,000 silent dinners. 1,000 times she looked at me not as her husband, but as a potential subject. I don't know who she is anymore. And I don't think I know who I am, with her. I read the words again and again, each time the meaning carving deeper into my soul. I've fallen out of love with her. The sentence was simple. Devastating in its simplicity. It wasn't a passionate, angry declaration. It was a quiet, resigned, final truth. A death certificate for our marriage, signed and dated by the one person whose signature mattered most. This was the infidelity. Not a physical affair, but an emotional one. A complete transfer of intimacy. He hadn't given his body to someone else, he had given his heartbreak, his vulnerability, his fears, his inner world, the very core of what a marriage is built on, to another person. He had built a secret life, not of passion, but of profound sorrow and disconnection, and he had shared it all with this mysterious D. And the kids he referred to? As I read the messages again, the context dawning on me with a sickening horror, I finally understood. It was us. Our shared history, the life we had built together, the 15-year investment. That was the child we were trying to protect, the reason for his patience, for this slow, quiet, dignified death of our love. We were staying together for the sake of the ghost of our former selves. I sat on the floor of my office, surrounded by the shredded remains of other people's lies, holding in my hand the tiny, black proof of my own. The master of deception, utterly, completely deceived. Not by him, not really, but by myself. I had been so busy looking for the classic, cinematic signs of betrayal, the other woman, the clandestine meetings, the heated texts, that I had missed the entire, slow-motion collapse of the foundation. I was so expert at spotting the dramatic, flaming crash of infidelity that I hadn't noticed our love dying of a quiet, painless starvation, a lack of the very nutrients I was so busy denying it, trust, vulnerability, and my undivided, unsuspicious attention. He found me there an hour later. I hadn't moved. I was still on the floor, my back against the filing cabinet, the dead, black phone resting in my open palm like a dead bird, my face dry and numb with a shock so profound it had bypassed tears. He stood in the doorway, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, his keys jangling in his hand. He'd been at the gym, or so he'd told me. His eyes went from my frozen face to the object in my lap, and all the color drained from his, leaving him pale and gaunt. He knew. He didn't need to ask. The truth was in the air, thick and suffocating. "Elena," he whispered, his voice ragged, broken. I looked up at him, the man I had loved since I was 20 years old. The man whose face was more familiar to me than my own. And I saw him, truly saw him, for the first time in years. I saw the deep wells of sadness in his eyes, the weary, defeated set of his shoulders, the profound emotional exhaustion that had nothing to do with work or the gym. I saw a man who had been lonely in his own home, in his own marriage, for a very, very long time. I saw the subject of my last and most painful case. "Who is Dee?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady, flat, the voice I used with clients when delivering bad news. He didn't try to lie. He didn't get angry. He just leaned his head against the doorframe, as if his legs could no longer hold the weight of his body, or the weight of this moment. "My sister," he said softly, the words barely audible. "Diana." His older sister. Diana. Who lived in Portland. The one he'd always been close to, the one I'd always liked, the one I'd encouraged him to call more often because he seemed happier after he talked to her. The irony was so sharp, so perfectly aimed, it felt like a physical blow, knocking the last remaining air from my lungs. I hadn't been the other woman. I had been the villain in the secret, desperate conversations he was having with his own sister. The whole, sad story tumbled out of him then, there on the floor of my office, surrounded by the ghosts of other failed relationships. He didn't blame me, not outright. He didn't shout or accuse. He just explained. He painted a picture of our life together that I barely recognized, a picture seen through the lens of his profound loneliness. He talked about the silence that had grown between us, a silence I had mistaken for comfort. He talked about feeling like he was constantly living with a detective who was always, subconsciously, on the job, collecting data, analyzing his behavior. He said every conversation felt like a gentle interrogation, every question a search for inconsistency, a crack in his story. He felt he couldn't be vulnerable, couldn't have a bad day, couldn't express doubt or fear or insecurity, because he was worried I would see it as a sign, a symptom of a deeper problem, a crack in the facade of our perfect marriage that I would feel compelled to investigate and fix. "You stopped seeing me, Elena," he said, his voice thick with a grief I now understood had been festering for years. "You saw a husband. A concept. A role that was either being performed correctly or wasn't. I felt like I was constantly being audited for loyalty, for happiness, for the correct emotional responses. And I was always coming up short. I couldn't breathe. I started talking to Diana because I had nowhere else to put it all. I was drowning in this marriage, and she was the only one on the shore, the only one who would just listen without taking notes. I listened, and as I did, the last of my self-deception, the final lie I had been clinging to, crumbled into dust. He was right. It was a terrible, humbling, devastating truth. I had become so vigilant in my professional life, so attuned to the micro-expressions of guilt and deception, that I had unknowingly, unintentionally, brought that hypervigilance home. I had stopped trusting. I had stopped being his soft place to fall and had become, without even realizing it, his warden. I was so busy protecting our marriage from external, fictional threats that I had failed to notice the internal rot, the slow erosion of intimacy caused by my own unyielding scrutiny. I had been the architect of my own heartbreak, lovingly, carefully building the very walls that had imprisoned us both and starved our love to death. We didn't fight that night. There were no screaming matches, no thrown plates, no dramatic accusations. How could there be? The enemy wasn't in the room with us. The enemy was the space between us, the silence we had both cultivated, the roles we had unknowingly slipped into. The affair wasn't with another person, it was with our own misunderstandings, our own unspoken resentments, our own profound failure to see each other. We had both failed. He had failed to fight for me, to shake me out of my detachment, to demand that I see him. And I had failed to simply look. He moved out the next week. It was his idea, but I didn't fight it. I had no fight left in me. The house, our beautiful, painstakingly restored fortress, was now a tomb, a museum dedicated to a marriage that was no longer alive. Every room held a ghost. The couch where we used to cuddle and watch old movies. The kitchen where we cooked elaborate meals together on Sunday afternoons, laughing and bumping hips. His studio, now empty and echoing, the sunlight feeling accusatory and cold rather than warm and inspiring. I was alone with Buster, our dog, and the deafening silence I had supposedly been so good at interpreting. The silence now had a voice, and it told me everything I had missed. I closed Veritas Investigations a month later. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't sit across from another heartbroken woman and promise her the truth, when I had been so spectacularly blind to my own. I couldn't be the purveyor of a certainty I no longer believed in. The irony was a bitter pill I had to swallow every single morning when I woke up in our empty bed. I, the expert on betrayal, had been betrayed not by my husband's love for another, but by my own inability, my own refusal, to see the love dying a slow, quiet death right in front of me. My career was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide had finally come in. The months that followed were a long, gray, arduous trek through the bleak landscape of grief. It was a different kind of grief than if he'd died. This was more complicated, more nuanced, more laced with a sickening regret. He was still alive, just living in a small, sterile apartment across town, a place I had never seen. We talked sometimes, awkward, painful conversations about logistics, about selling the house, about dividing our shared life into two separate, sad piles of possessions. There was no hatred between us, only a vast, sad ocean of regret and a mutual, unspoken acknowledgement of a shared failure. We had both been captains of a ship we let drift onto the rocks. I started therapy. I had to understand how I, of all people, had missed it. I had to dissect my own blindness. My therapist, a kind, patient woman named Dr. Evans, helped me see that my job wasn't the cause of our problems, but a symptom of a deeper issue. My need for certainty, for black and white truths, for clean, binary answers, was a shield. In a world of messy, complicated, ambiguous human emotions, my job provided clear, definitive answers. Someone was guilty or innocent. A marriage was salvageable or it wasn't. There was a villain and a victim. I had tried to force my own marriage, with its subtle shades of gray, its quiet disappointments and its unspoken joys, into that same rigid, unforgiving framework. I was looking for clues of a crime, when I should have been looking for signs of a human being in pain. In doing so, I had suffocated its beautiful, necessary ambiguities. I had tried to solve my husband when I should have just loved him. I began to write. Not case reports, but journals. I filled notebook after notebook with my thoughts, my memories, my regrets, my anger, my profound sadness. I wrote about David, about us, about the slow, insidious way we had drifted apart, like two continents separating over millennia. I wrote about the man he was when I met him, and the man he became, and the role I played in that transformation. I wasn't writing for a client. I was writing for myself, trying to find a narrative for my own life that wasn't about blame and guilt, but about understanding, about the tragic, human flaws that lead good people to hurt each other. It was the most difficult, most painful investigation of my life, and there was no final report, only a slow, painful process of acceptance. A year after he moved out, we met for coffee. It was a bright, crisp autumn day, the kind we used to love, when the air smells of wood smoke and dying leaves. He looked better. Healthier. The deep weariness in his eyes had lessened, though a sadness remained, a permanent scar. He had started painting again, he told me, for himself, not for clients. Landscapes. Empty, beautiful, silent landscapes. We talked about mundane things at first, about Buster, about a movie he'd seen, and then, tentatively, carefully, we talked about us. I'm sorry, I said, the words feeling both inadequate and monumental. I'm sorry I stopped seeing you. I'm sorry I made you feel like you were under investigation in your own home. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, his gaze was clear, direct, and held no resentment, only a quiet, profound sorrow. I'm sorry I stopped trying to make you see me, he replied, stirring his latte. I gave up, Elena. I checked out and I talked to Diana instead of fighting for us, instead of shaking you and saying, it's me. It's just me, and I'm struggling. That was my failure. I was a coward. It was the first time we had shared the blame, not as a weapon to hurt each other, but as a heavy burden we both acknowledged carrying. There was no reconciliation. That ship had sailed, sunk to the bottom of that ocean of regret. The passionate, romantic love we had was gone, not with a dramatic, fiery explosion, but with a whisper, a slow exhalation that lasted for years. But in its place was something new, something fragile and hard-won, a mutual respect. A recognition of the two flawed, broken people we were, and the profound tragedy of our poor timing, our miscommunication, our unspoken needs. We sold the brownstone. It was a clean break, a necessary amputation. I moved into a small, light-filled apartment on the other side of the city with a view of the skyline. I didn't buy new furniture for a long time. I lived with the bare essentials, needing the space to be mine, to reflect who I was becoming, not who I had been as part of a couple. I needed to breathe my own air. I started a new business, but it was different. I called it Ampersand Solutions. I became a consultant for couples going through amicable separations. I used my skills for good, not to find evidence of wrongdoing, but to help people untangle their lives, their finances, their shared histories, with dignity and respect. I helped them communicate, I mediated difficult conversations, I helped them see each other clearly and compassionately one last time as they parted ways. I became an expert in graceful endings, in the art of letting go without destroying each other in the process. I helped them avoid the silent, slow death that had claimed my own marriage. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the lights outside my window are like a field of fallen stars, I think about Mrs. Albrecht and what she said to me in my office, surrounded by the proof of her husband's infidelity. She was wiser than I could have ever known. My legacy isn't the hundreds of cheating husbands I caught, the lies I exposed, the tearful gratitude of the wives I saved. That was someone else's life, a character I played. My real legacy is the one I missed, the slow, quiet, almost imperceptible departure of my own husband's heart. It's the understanding that the most dangerous lies aren't the ones others tell us, but the comforting, desperate stories we weave for ourselves to make the unbearable truth seem livable for just one more day. I spent my life looking for monsters in the shadows, for villains in the dark, while the real tragedy was the slow, inexorable fading of the light in my own home. And the moral of my story, the one I etch on my heart every single morning when I wake up alone, is a simple, devastating truth I learned too late, a truth that cost me everything. The most important investigation you will ever conduct is the one into your own heart, and it's the only case you're guaranteed to lose if you never even bother to look.